Hey, you. Yeah, you. My partner and I saw you cross the tavern, and you stuck out as the enterprising sort. Someone who's tired of eating cave mushroom soup. Someone with the drive to escape this void-cursed rock. Well, tell you what, we've got a skiff loaded with a pallet of coffins parked out back. Take it to Sirius XY to the Golden Brew Inn, drop it off and back, and this gold could be yours. Before you go, if you hear moaning from the cargo, don't look inside, at least not if you value your brains. I'm your friendly, spacefaring necro-capitalist, and you're listening to Campaign Spotlight.
Hey there, Tyrannosaurus zombies and Batiri queens.
Welcome to another episode of Campaign Spotlight.
This week, we'll be chatting with Perry, who will be sharing a thoughtful approach to playing in a module setting.
Let's roll initiative.
It has been 7 days since the start of the Death Curse, and the first travelers come to Port 9 Zaro looking to end this curse that threatens the world. A discreet meeting has been called by the merchant princes of the Port of 9 Zaro to Golden Throne. They gather to discuss the curse and the increasing arrival of foreigners by ship, sea and air, and magical means from across the world of Faerun to the port. The princes speak of the wealth that can be gained from all these parties arriving that are being sent out into the jungles. The princes also discuss the state of the present arrangements and relationships with the various outside organizations having influence in the port beyond their control. These matters unsettle several of the older princes, and doesn't much bother the younger princes. The older princes, who were children at the time, remember the lands when the foreigners were in control and the battles that were fought to cast them off these shores. The younger princes welcome the wealth and the power that they have gained in their open and hidden alliances with the foreigners. But to become a prince means that there are no strangers to the games of power. The princes eventually agree to increase and strengthen their collective forces beyond the foreigners that are presently here. A day or so later, an announcement is made to the people of Port 9 Zaro from the princes. The princes are seeking new members to their merchant houses. Those potential new members are to help provide more services and labor to the princes, as they address the needs of the increasing number of visitors to the port. Those interested are to come to the Red Bazaar and seek Baza Nef to be considered. New hires will be placed into teams to complete different assignments for the princes. In time, those who show skill, good work ethic, and loyalty will be selected to officially become members of any of the respected prince's house. A wage will be paid to the teams at the completion of each assignment. Any items found and collected during the task may be kept or provided to the princes. These items will be sold, and a percentage of the sale goes to the finder.
This sounds like such a cool campaign. Perry, welcome to Campaign Spotlight.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's really a privilege to get to speak with you. First off, can you tell our audience a little bit about your experience with tabletop games?
Yes. So I've been playing games off and on in the tabletop arena for probably a little over 20 years now. Started in when I got into college and so forth, and there's a bunch of stuff, backstory, not pleasant with that. So we're looking at like 98 or so. No, sorry, like 96, 98 and so forth. And so I've been playing since then. And most of which, as like all players, I started as a player. And with time, eventually I was like, I wanted to play some of my stories or ideas that were percolating up. And so that sort of started my path to starting to get to understand what it meant to be a DM or game master, which has also led to an evolution over time and probably easily has me as being a forever GM, even though I also like to play too. But I'm located in the Silicon Valley, San Jose area of California. So there's also a degree of interest in tech in this area. So can't help but notice how many various games like Baldur's Gate right now came out of, started with tabletop, moved into the electronic era, and just notice also the rails that those games have versus the rails that show up when I'm running a tabletop.
Absolutely. When you say you're a forever GM, by the way, do you still get a chance to be a player ever?
I actually have been able to get the chance to be a player right now.
I'm glad to hear it.
Not as much in D&D, but also in some of the other games out there. I am presently now one of the cast members on Symphony Entertainment, which does a lot of horror role-playing games. So periodically,
Ooh.
I'm one of the cast there, getting to play as whenever we stream. And at this point, I'm in the process of trying to write my first game. It's going to be for Chult, not for Chult, for Call of Cthulhu, to try and have it published. So there's one of those evolutions from being a player to being a GM to trying to now actually write myself something to be published as well.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. We'll link to the channel in the show notes that you're currently on, and when you have the Call of Cthulhu game published, we might have to have you back on the show to hear about that.
And equally, I'm also a member of the Knights of the Fourth Wall, which puts on the mega dungeon at Kubla Khan here in the Bay. So every year we're putting together a multi-table massive group adventure with multiple interconnected stories. So that's one of the other projects right now I have to put some brains time to.
That sounds so incredibly fun. You have a ton of experience DMing, probably the most of anyone we've ever had on the show, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about this campaign in particular.
Oh yeah. So unlike probably some of the people who've been on the past, what brought this game together was actually spite. At the time when Wizards of the Coast had produced and announced Tomb of Annihilation and then said that they were setting it in one of their African analogs, is like, oh great, we finally get to see something beyond just the Sword Coast. And so I was very much starting to watch the playthroughs, trying to get my hands on the book as soon as I get there. And as soon as I started really looking at it and seeing what was coming up, I was left very, very, very pissed.
Yeah, and just to be clear for the audience, this Tomb of Annihilation module came out in 2017, right? Like, this is actually a pretty recent publication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's within with just shy of this decade.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess we can talk a little bit about the setting, Chult. Mm-hmm. This dates back to, I think, the 90s in other modules, like the first, it's second edition D&D, like 93, I think, was the first time Chult showed up. And it is, as you say, Wizards of the Coast Africa analog setting, or really, go for it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it does go back to second edition, as I was discovering in my research as I was starting looking at materials for it. And it is probably one of two African analogs, as far as I can tell. So this one in Chult is more of the jungle rainforest variant, which also pulls some variants that might be seen also in Asia, too. So India's rainforest and some of like areas also from like Thailand and so forth. But essentially, it's very much coded as being an African analog. I think the other section is more of either the Sahara or more of the Serengeti. I just hadn't done much more research into that, but as I was focusing on it, and based off the history, well, then when you introduce into this environment, there's really only one quote-unquote civilized location to land on Chult itself, and that's Port Nyanzaro, which, again, as you look at the history that has been put together, at one point it is a colony of the Kingdom of Am, or protectorate at this point of the Kingdom of Am. So at one point, basically, we've already got the start and the analog of colonization hitting up into this setting.
It's really baked in. Yeah, there's also, I think in the older books, there's like a secret hidden other city. That is, there's also Mesro, and it is kind of like hidden, and the whole idea, I think, in all the adventures written for Chult, is that it's kind of external adventurers who have this is foreign. They use the word jungle like 2 or 3 times a paragraph, and it's just like, this is another place that is exotic and strange, and that is like that seems baked into every adventure written for Chult.
Very much so, and that every adventurer is coming here, playing, for lack of a better word, the savior trope.
Yes.
Which again, added to just my feelings of like, oh, I'm just so, no, this cannot stand. And
Yeah.
so as I'm, and in those early beginning stages, I'm seeing this as, okay, so let me rewrite this story. And what I'm seeing here as lacking for the environment, that aren't just one-dimensional postcard characters. And no, instead of it's going to be a foreign team that's going to be adventuring here, let's have this be the locals protecting their home. Because, I mean, we get all the stories about, protect Waterdeep, protect Baldur's Gate, which are, if not out the roaming bands of murder hobos, or it's the people that are in surrounding area, but you don't get the story of, usually get the story that these are the locals who have decided that enough is enough.
Yes. I mean, and in the Tomb of Annihilation kind of in the text, they suggest just teleport your adventurers in on day one to speed up the story of them getting there. Like it is directly baked in that they are from somewhere else. They're from Sword Coast or something, and they are coming to save the day, I guess.
Yeah, and equally that standpoint of the idea of the death curse, which I did decide to go ahead and keep in the game that I was playing because it sets as a nice hallmark and raises the stakes of what is going on when you don't have resurrection magic and not coming back. It really brings up a lot of what's going on when people now who have been able to have that ability have lost it. What are they willing to do to try and protect themselves? Who's willing to take advantage of that aspect of that vulnerability? And how will our players make choices when it comes to that point of being at near life and death? And that actually did come up during the game where one of my players died.
Your player character or your actual player?
As I'm GM, one of my players, because I did not do player character in all of this, but one of my players did actually die fully. I mean, missed all the death saves, which created a bunch of issues in that, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I think it's because of addressing that my game, which originally I had thought about and was a running joke at our table, was supposed to only be about 6 months. It ended up being running for 4 years.
I don't think I've ever planned for a game to end in like a specific period and had that work out. Yeah. So I definitely know that feeling. At the beginning of lockdown, I started a campaign with some friends, and we were like, well, lockdown's going to last maybe 2 or 3 months. So let's just do like a mini campaign that lasts that long. Yep. And 2 years later, we finally were wrapping it up.
Yep. Well, we actually began the game in 2018 before the pandemic and such. And I continued running it during the pandemic, which was our way also of getting through the pandemic as well.
Absolutely.
So it was great for my players. And also one of the things for myself, it was a way for me to have something else to do as a therapist, because I'm dealing with day in and day out everyone who's having their issues with dealing with the isolation, the pandemic. So it's something that let me shift away from dealing with that.
Absolutely, that makes a ton of sense. Let's talk a little bit more about the campaign. It's kind of based off of Tomb of Annihilation. As you say, the Death Curse, legitimately a really cool concept. Nightmare Serpent, one of my favorite dungeons. Let's talk more about that later. But you made some big changes to Tomb of Annihilation.
Right. So going back to that aspect of the Foreigner and the way they had designed the game, it's a hex crawl. So instead of it being crawling through the dungeon, you're crawling across the landscape of Chult that has been mostly pretty much reclaimed by nature to this one of the multiple forgotten cities in Chult, because there's multiple ones there.
Oh, are there? Okay.
Oh, yes. And that's also one of the things that sort of gets into this, that you're getting from Port Nine-Zaro to the Kingdom of Omu, that's the one. Omu, which is where the tomb has been placed. But there are multiple other cities and empires that would have been on this had circumstances not happened that caused them to fall into decay. And that's a bunch of what also went into when I was researching the history of this continent and when I was conceiving this game. And so I was going for this 6-month game originally was, let's get the characters to find Mesro, and we ended there.
Cool.
But the fact that I think the player character died in like session 4, we hadn't even hit 10 yet when this character died.
Oh no.
And it was a mixture of things, because as it turns out at that point, that particular player character was also going through a health issue and was going to have to step away from the table for a while. And the circumstances of when their character died just happened to be at that day they were going to be stepping away for their medical care. And at that point, which gets also into our table dynamics, there's a question of whether or not I had done that on purpose, which I hadn't. It was just the luck of the die.
Right.
And that player was very much attached to that character as quickly as it developed. And it's like, okay, I got to find a way to bring this character back, sort of having them make a new character.
Right.
And I think that's part of what opened the door, which started leading to the development of from my original idea to the meta story that was going to play out over these next 4 years. That just kept developing as it's like I find this interesting bit of history of where am I sending them to. And so the goal of the story, the meta story, became not so much the aspect of dealing with Death Curse, because I was just not going to touch the Death Curse. And we've got all these other adventures, all these other gods sending their forces in to deal with it. That's not the worry. The worry in this case is Dindar the Night Serpent.
Excellent.
Who is the UNT god of nightmares, who is buried under Chult.
Right.
And so as I'm looking at the history and looking at the relationship between Uptau and Dindar, it's like Uptau confined Dindar under Chult and put him to sleep. So at some point, there's an epic battle between the two of them somewhere in the future, which is supposed to end the world.
Right.
So what happens, and this is the premise I put in, is that Azirak, or Azarak, had put the death curse and soulmonger there. It's leaking off necromantic energy. Massive amounts of necromantic energy. Enough that Dindar is also sort of benefiting from that energy, and it's going to break the spell that's got him bound and asleep.
Got it.
So if he wakes up, or should I say it wakes up, it's going to escalate the death toll radically.
Got it. So the death curse is a thing in this world, but that is not that's not the exigency here. That's not That's
not the goal. It's affecting everything, but that's not the goal. Uptau ultimately wants Dindar to stay asleep.
Yes.
And so our ultimate meta story is our adventurers being tasked ultimately after bringing Uptau back officially to Chult is to go and keep Dindar asleep and bound so that they don't have to have their great battle in the world.
Right. And the player characters are, and that's kind of where the campaign ends up, right? That is kind of the end of it was a success on this front.
Unfortunately, my table broke up before we finally got to that denouement, but I'm also happy to share what the plans were for that. But they got very close to that ending. We started everybody at level 3, and I think we had just reached level 18 in the characters before our table.
Wow! Oh, so this went way up to the epic levels.
Mm-hmm.
That's very fun. Let's talk about. But they started. So they started at level 3. Mm-hmm. I guess what kind of background, what kind of connection did they have to Dindar and Uptau and everything going on at the start of the campaign?
So some would say this is where, again, because it was living in my head for a long time, so I was figuring out all the different connection threads. And so this became also down to what did my players pick? So I had a mage hunter, and I should also add, part of what also made this work, not just me going through the history, was also the DM's Guild, because they did put out more materials that helped, but still left a lot of areas about the social structure, things that actually make a world work beyond just an adventure, and especially for those that are going to be playing the locals.
Yes.
So I pulled a lot of information from there. So I had one player who was a mage hunter. So that was my sorcerer character. We had a bard who later became my custom class of the griot. We had a ranger who was originally an apprentice who was going to be one of the guides that would take people out into the forest.
Okay.
We had a a goblin cleric who was of the goblin race of the island, and he became the cleric to the merchant god, and I'm blanking on their name, because he ate their
Joaquin.
Yeah, because he ate the cleric of Joaquin.
He ate the cleric of Joaquin.
Yeah, he ate the cleric of Joaquin, and Joaquin was like, "No, my investment in this is coming back. You now work for me, and guess what? You're now a vegetarian."
That's extremely fun.
Oh, and he played it quite lovingly. And whenever he would speak, he would go into a combination of Veer and Londo from Babylon 5.
That's ambitious.
Oh yes, we had quite a fun with that one. But we're again playing one of the goblin races of Chult, who's walking around as the deal maker. We also had the albino dwarfs. I had a character who played a barbarian so I had an albino dwarf who was a barbarian, and we always had the jokes about him walking around in a muumuu.
Wait, why?
Well, albino, light sensitivity.
Yes.
Tropical environment. Above ground.
Right.
So, so you've got this albino dwarf barbarian running to battle wearing a muumuu. Which...
I mean, it's practical.
Yeah, it's practical. And as their story developed, he has a barbarian, because again, I had to reskin so many things. Instead of being the barbarian path of the bear, we made him the barbarian path of the T-Rex.
Oh, because Chult has dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm. And that's aspect. So that also means that there's a whole slew of animals and all the settings that had to be shifted to fit that environment, which also led to me creating circumstances of turning our barbarian into a were T-Rex.
Very cool. And that's how rage worked?
It was part of his rage, but it was circumstances that played out in the story. I permitted the opportunity of, instead of having like a were tiger, which is in the setting, we now have a were T-Rex.
Very cool. Honestly, way cooler than a were tiger.
Exactly. So we had that character. Then we had, and because I had a few guest characters come in, but we had one other player who joined after the death of that first character.
Yes.
And he came in first time as a monk, as a tabaxi. And then there was a point where it's like sort of reached a good natural place for his story to end. And so he came in then he invented another character. And this was the one exception I was making, because this wasn't a local character. This was a character that came in this case, from the Asian analog of the world. And what then also began, again, because of the nature of things that were playing out, you look at any adventuring party, you've got white character, some person of color, white character. So we've got all these essentially locals and the one oddball out, which is this now Asian character who morphs between a human and a kitsune.
Very cool.
Who's now playing as part of this team. And then, of course, their sidekick, which was one of the frog people named Froke, who was a rogue.
Who was a what?
He's so the frog people, I forget exactly the name of the
grung.
The grung, who is a frog rogue.
Oh, okay. Sorry, that took me a sec.
That's right. And so they're both misadventures, and they're aspects of moving from Port 9 being the only place where people are able to live and satisfy, to not only taking Dindar and putting him back to sleep, but beginning to rebuild Chult itself and bring back kingdoms.
That sounds like, I mean, when we think of goals for campaigns that actually are more than just like, we need to defeat the one enemy, we need to slay the one monster. That sounds like a pretty satisfying one. Although I think, given what we have about Chult in Tomb of Annihilation, I guess this took a lot of on your part, a lot of additional world building to actually have kind of a Chult that made sense to focus on rebuilding, eh?
Well, yeah, and rebuilding wasn't even, again, the goal. The goal at that point was put Dindar back to sleep.
Right.
But in the process, it comes back to bringing Mesro back, setting up another kingdom in one of the fallen ones to become one of the new bastions of civilization, which my mage hunter became the queen of.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so at that point, that character left the campaign and became the queen?
Well, no, she was the queen, and she also eventually became a representative of Uptau and was going to have a 500-year lifespan.
Oh, wow. So she was the queen and the pope and a member of the party. And
Yeah.
500 years. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. So some of the arcs that develop is, yeah, the mage hunter goes to, and at that point in time, she was like one of your just average mages, to being one of the most powerful mages on the continent, next to the ones that are in Mesro. A selected representative of the god, kind of not so much a pope, but maybe a bishop.
Okay.
And now queen leader of rebuilding us one of the kingdoms with the ideas of like slavery does not exist in this kingdom. It's not accepted.
And did this objective of becoming this political leader, did that come from the player, or was that kind of a choice that you gave to them?
It sort of developed, I would say, naturally with the way the things were materializing and how the player was playing it. Because I had some other storylines I was trying to play with that character, which weren't gelling as well, but that sort of started becoming the case as she became more and more powerful.
I mean, I guess that makes sense. Once a character is like level 15, they are definitely, in terms of just physical power, more powerful than hundreds of people, but also just have capabilities that no one else has. So I guess that makes sense that they would become political leaders. I guess in this context, did she have some pre-existing connection to that the former kingdom that had been there that she was restoring? Okay.
So, sort of getting back into the arc of the story. So
Yes.
we go back to the aspects of everyone has started out working and answering the calls of the princes. So these players all been put together as one of the different various work teams.
Right.
And as they started going off in various assignments from their first one was just gather the environments, protect those who were gathering the aspects, and came back successful. And they were working for one prince. Well, one of the other princes hears how successful they were, what came back, and says, well, because this was one of the other mission options I had given them, I want you to come work and do this assignment for me. And that was one of the first aspects, and especially as I'm getting more settled into my GMship, of running a stealth mission and chase mission. So in that particular one, the three players that were able to make that day, it was basically a constant game of leapfrogging as they're following this person across the port to find where he's hiding the gems that have been stolen from the prince that's responsible for gems and gem merchandises and such. And she's happy with him, and so she says, okay, well, I need you to go find out what happened to my son, who took a band of adventurers out, and he's not back yet.
Got it.
And so at that point, this becomes an aspect of, okay, we're leaving the port, we're going, because we were sort of leaving the port, going into the jungle, coming back to the port. And so this is now we get the extended travel, and so I get to do a little of the hex crawl to go find out what happened to this son. So they go over to the Fort Belarus, I believe it is, and we have a little misadventure there as the fort is trying to be, these negative forces are trying to take down the fort. And they're basically bringing up, and this is one of those things I invented, was an army of wraiths.
Interesting.
And so they're in the battle of trying to protect the fort with the people that are there from this army of wraiths that are coming in to basically turn this into another place of death. And,
Got it.
And that is unfortunately where the situation is. I have the death of my characters.
Oh, so this is really early on. Okay, okay.
Yeah, early on.
And is that kind of their first taste of the kind of undead flavor that this campaign had? Or
No, actually, one of the earlier ones is when they're making the journey to the fort, they encounter something that was, again, one of the slow builds for the game, was that they had discovered this, what almost looked like this flesh orb that had been consuming and killing these two pterodactyls. But they couldn't tell what it was. And so they had called it the cyst. And knowing that it was causing death and that it didn't like radiant and life magic, okay, we're finding, but they're not sure what it is. It's never been seen before in any of the history of Chult. And what this ended up being was, it was sort of the proto-egg form of what I call the necromites.
okay.
And the premise behind that was, just because Dindar is a god and a demon and it's a snake doesn't mean it can't have parasites.
Interesting. Okay, got it. So this is really fleshing out kind of the horrifying aberration end of things, and not just. So you weren't just you were not only building building out the society and kind of building out the setting. You were also building more monsters to make it more kind of nightmare serpent themed. And I've got it.
Which originally at this point I still hadn't figured out that their meta story was going to be dealing with Dindar. It was
really?
just
Okay.
fine, just get them to Mesra was the goal I was thinking. And it's at this point where the character dies, and now the circumstances are coming up. It's like, how do I get this character back?
Yes.
With the death curse, and that's when it suddenly struck me, there is a way kind of to deal with it, a cheat around. And so I built that into that standpoint that the forces that brought this character back to them were connected to Uptal. Uptal had never really abandoned Chult, but due to certain other circumstances, which also helped me set up their big bad, who's manipulating everything around this. And it's because of what I had to deal with to try and figure out a way to bring that character back. And I don't want to give that part away until we get to a relevant area.
Okay.
Their big bad in this case, and if you look at most D&D campaigns, you either got like a king or a bard, pissed off druid, some sort of clerical character who's pissed, or you do it. But instead, your big bad in this case was a bard.
Interesting.
And this bard had once been someone who was going to basically serve Uptal, but switched and started serving Dindar because in the great battle that happened between them and he sealed him, this guy fell prey to Dindar's poison.
Oh, and was corrupted by Dindar.
And thusly became Dindar's, instead of Griot of history and people and lore, he's now Dindar's maestro of nightmares and phantasms.
When you say Griot, by the way, could you explain that a little bit?
So in African culture, the idea of the Griot is the storyteller, history keeper. So and it's usually done more orally. So that's also why it's like bard is the natural sort of fade into
analog
to this. And so they're the living embodiment of the history of a place and of the people who was born, who did great deeds. Again, it's really fitting onto the aspect of the bard, but they're really, again, a walking library of history. And so this is not a class that exactly exists under the Bard Lord.
Right.
So because usually they're keeping multiple different vistas, but no, this is the history of this continent. So it comes imbued within slightly different rules sets. So essentially someone who becomes, especially a Griot of Uptal, basically becomes a living embodiment of the spell legend lore.
Interesting. And your bard in your campaign kind of progressed into this class.
Which was my own custom class for this setting.
Did you it was fully fleshed out as like a class with...
As much as we could.
Wow.
So, yeah, so whenever if he's not concentrating, he sees people, he suddenly sees their entire family history. If he picks up an item, he knows the entire history of what this item has been in this context. And so that, again, is one of those aspects of when Am came in It was killing the groots. It was killing the wizards and so forth, which is part of why, which gets again into our aspect of, had all of those structures still been aspect, would Am have been able to colonize Chult?
Right. And I guess did you design this class in collaboration with the player?
Yeah.
Or did you design, okay, and I guess how did they respond? I'm fascinated how your players interacted with the setting.
Oh, very much so. Well, let's put it this way. By the end of it, and which ties into sort of the mystery with his character, is no one's actually sure exactly how he got reborn. And what machinations the Uptao had to do, which broke some rules to get him back. And not fall to the Soulmonger, which played out with my other character who had taken on the Asian analog character, who, for the first time, and this was with agreement between the two of them,
Yes.
we played the game with that character becoming pregnant.
Oh, wow.
So periodically I would have this character roll dice and it's like, okay, here's the morning sickness that you're having.
Oh my goodness, okay.
And dealing with this as the body and the pregnancy started going on. And I set a certain timer clock that if they rolled either a 1 or a 20 on one of these checks, we were going to do the pregnancy and deliver.
The delivery, wow.
And that happened, which led to, on the fly, constructing an entire, was not even part of the plans for that day, but it meant constructing an entirely new scenario of things and monsters as we are setting up the aspect of, your water just broke. You're delivering, as it was, children. And we had triplets.
Oh, wow, okay. And did they travel with the party after that?
Well, here's the thing. Because this player was the human Kitsune, so you figure...
Yes.
What they gave birth to were eggs.
Oh, horrifying. Okay.
Yeah, these bejeweled eggs. And again, this is where I'm leaving a clue as to what's going on with the other character if you know the monsters and lore of the various creatures. So they ended up giving birth to 3 eggs.
Okay.
In the process, dying as well during childbirth.
The character died. Wow. Okay.
During the childbirth with the second one. And they managed to bring him back. They hadn't reached all their death saves and gave birth to the 3 eggs. And at which point, knowing what they were dealing with, they sent the eggs off to be kept safe for later on. Which, again, had the game completed, I would have had, here's the hatching of the eggs, and you discover what and who's inside of each of these eggs.
And what would they have discovered?
So, at the end of the game, they would have discovered that one of the eggs now was produced a Tabaxi Kitsune.
Interesting.
So that one child would have been able to move between a Tabaxi form and a Kitsune form. And was blessed by the Fae.
Very cool.
And again, this gets into a lot of, again, the larger histories and structures that I had to build in this because I hadn't built a lot of stuff around histories of Asia. So there was that. Then there was going to be the human Asian child who is now a citizen of Chult. And he was going to ultimately be a divine soul sorcerer.
Makes sense, I guess. Yeah, I'm thinking about what divine soul means, yeah.
And connected to Uptao as their source.
Sure.
The last one, which gets into what was how I had been maneuvering things, is essentially it was given birth to a Quaddle.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Because my workaround in this was the character who had died. His soul hadn't fully transferred yet so that the Soulmonger got in. So Uptao reached and grabbed the soul and then bound it to a Quaddle.
Wow. Okay.
And since the Quaddle can shapeshift, it just shapeshift into what he normally looked like.
Wow. And okay. And that was going to be part of kind of the post final battle denouement was this part.
Well, no, actually the final battle with the big bad was ultimately when we were going to reveal, oh no, you've got a Quaddle in you. You've been coexisting with a Quaddle.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So this was my workaround around the death curse, that any soul that had been separated normally would have just gone to the soulmonger. But if the soul had been bound to something, it couldn't be taken by the soulmonger.
Got it. Okay, I really like that as a workaround for the death curse and a way to make it feel special, I think.
Exactly.
When a character dies and gets to evade the rules a little bit, because that's going to happen with these are legendary characters at some point.
Exactly. And so that was the solution I had found to be able to bring him back despite the death curse. And at this point, he's the only person who's managed to come back from death.
Yes.
So he's already not just come back from death, he's now also the Griot of Uptal. And that's what leads also into the aspect of the relationship with our Nightmare Maestro, is that Uptal didn't actually abandon Chult.
Yes.
But because of the workings and manipulations of the Maestro, he couldn't interface with the world the way he had usually done. So instead of broad action, he was doing more laser focus and limited action. So there were still those in Chult who were gifted with Uptal's blessings, but they just couldn't operate as openly as they normally had been.
Right, but after everything is restored, now they can.
Right, and so this also includes bringing back Mesro.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense.
And Mesro is Uptal's holy city. So, lo and behold, and so my solution there, based again, looking at the history, looking at where timelines fell across the entire world, Mesro also disappeared about the same time as the spell plague.
Got it, okay.
And so my solution here is that Mesro is sitting on basically a spell, or like a ley line or a spell node.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this is a lot of additional world building went into explaining what was happening here.
Exactly, and knowing that the spell plague was going on, but also they had their own issue with Rasnisi, who was a paladin of Uptal who had the ability to raise the dead, was marching on their city. So, killed two birds with one stone. They basically ported the city out of this existence into another plane. And so, basically, I had decided their way of avoiding the issue with spell Rasnisi, but also dealing with the spell plague that was about to hit the land and warp magic, was to teleport themselves off into another dimension.
Wow, okay.
But, again, they're teleporting off just as the spell plague's hitting, so something went foobar with that.
Got it.
And so I had the players eventually return to where Mesro once was and find a portal to take them to Mesro. The thing was that, again, everything's screwed up because of the spell plague, and so instead of them just straight teleporting there, they basically have to work their way through the energetic layers to get to Mesro. So they go through sort of a mass energy field into the elemental chaos and all the other sort of forces that would be necessary to maintain a plane of existence.
Fascinating. And this sounds like a much more narratively satisfying journey than the Mesro from kind of the original Chult adventures, which is just they've chosen to hide themselves from the outside world through some kind of magic.
Exactly. Well, and it's still the same thing, only instead of, here's the invisibility spell, no, they just plane shifted.
Right. But it's not just you discover it. You would then have to actually journey through to the other side.
Right. And so once they got there, they begin to find out the situation. But because of their arrival, it shifted things. So originally, the city was always shifting with a connection to the various elemental planes. So it would go earth, fire, water. And so the elementals were coming through periodically and fighting with the city.
Okay.
Their arrival shifted things, and now it's connected to the abyss.
Oh, shoot. Okay, so now the things that are coming through are an order of magnitude worse.
Exactly. And so one of the things they basically now have to convince the city to do is cut the spell and return to the real world.
And do they do that successfully?
Yes, they do. And Mesro rematerializes back into its location back on Chult, which now shifts the balance of power, being the only civilized place you can go to is Port 9 Zaro. No, now it's Port 9 Zaro and Mesro.
Right, and Mesro's kind of I guess, a larger city than the port, or how should we think about it?
So with the way they describe Port Nine Zara, you maybe got 200 to 300 people living in there. Mesro was essentially fully functional city before Chult's fall. So you've got maybe several thousand.
Got it. And so the players are kind of wreaking pretty substantial changes on the world.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, how did that feel for them? What was the reaction of your players as they got to make these big changes?
It was definitely positive. That's what then sort of eventually led to the realization is we were playing out other things that have happened in African and African American history in these storylines, with the aspect of this and them resettling Mimbala as where my character, our mage hunter, becomes queen. It's kind of like the Back to Africa movement. It's also about the Pan-African idea of sovereignty. Especially against Am being the kingdom that basically feels like it has rule over this area.
Right.
But depending on the games, I made sure that history of the world were still moving in this game. And so it wasn't always just a spotlight on them. So they've not only got the kingdom of Am trying to reassert itself and gain control because it knows the death curse is here and its own internal politics is going on.
Of course.
I even started saying, well, the Red Wizards of Thay are coming here because guess what? They're all necromancers and liches, and this, again, is screwing up their process and their magocracy. So they've got a reason for wanting to get this resolved. One of the characters I also added, and again in building this, was coming from the Arab analog. And this is where I introduced one of their support characters and champions, and someone who could become a merchant prince is a bronze dragon who's posing as a human.
Okay.
And this becomes one of their, again, sources of support and building, as this bronze dragon is now going to make this place home. And equally, because I'm playing at multiple levels here, this dragon was sent by the gods of the dragons, because it doesn't want Dindar waking up either.
Right, so there's still a lot of forces external to Chult that are coming for it a little bit.
As well as then everything that's coming from what we call the Jade Empire at that point in time.
Yes.
I think it was Kaladmash or whatever the
yes,
the Asian analog and Japanese Chinese analog is in the world was also coming here because, again, this thing is affecting everyone around the world. So Port Nine Zara and Chult is becoming a major source and place that people know the name of.
Right, which comes with threats.
Exactly, and also becomes the key of what's setting up for the resources. And because the characters, once we add in our fourth character who's now playing as essentially as an Asian character.
Yes.
And even though they're disgraced amongst their kingdom for ideally failing in their original duties, we set up an agreement with them at Mimbala to host their airships.
Oh, interesting.
So it's no longer them going to Port Nine Zara. They're going to be coming to Mimbala as the trade location.
Interesting. And I think you're kind of illustrating why it does make a big difference that these characters are actually from Chult, and why this would have, I think, felt very different if they had teleported in from Waterdeep in session 1, because they're coming in, they're really involving themselves in the politics, and they're setting up structures of power, which you can do as like a high level party. You can kind of go in somewhere if you so choose, and completely change the politics of a place, let's say. And it sounds like the fact that the characters were from here made that feel very different and gives that a very different set of long run objectives than if they were just showing up, doing all of this, and teleporting away at the end of the adventure.
Exactly. So there's a vested interest in what's ideally their lives. And so, like, for the ranger character who had been training to be a guide, he ends up inheriting this old piece of armor from his family that no one had known much about, but it was this one piece of armor that apparently was also magical because it was stayed in good condition. Well, I placed this as being the aspect of the champion of Uptao. So this would have been his sort of fighter. And so as opposed to being more of a gladiatorial character, how is Uptao now dealing with a hunter character as his champion?
Yes.
And what was eventually going to happen was that he was going to get, he did get the bow. So I made this specialized bow that was because the armor he was wearing was the Kamadan, which is a combination of a leopard and a snake.
Okay.
And so he basically had the Kamadan's jaw, which would reshape itself from a staff into a bow.
So cool.
At which point he had two different types of arrows that he would be able to fire. One, which would be the jaguar's teeth, which would rip through like a jagged thorn arrow. And the other one was the serpent's fang, which would put people to sleep.
Oh, very cool. Okay.
So even there is like I'm having to retailor the weaponry and stuff to fit the environment. Because again,
absolutely,
that's where I went to the DM's Guild to find material to be able to build with, but I had to build even further to start customizing, such as like one of the things that was used from the DM Guild and weapons was Crow Collar, and that was being wielded by our barbarian, and that's a diamond-edged weapon.
Okay.
Compared to steel and all the other weapons that are, again, coming in from everyone else, this is literally a family heirloom for my character.
That makes a ton of sense. Have you thought of, I guess, because you made a whole Groot class, have you thought of putting that on the DM's Guild as well?
I don't think we did, because I had to work through, because I had to slam together a bunch of different classes to be able to make all the various abilities. So that was like, it's one thing to do it here, it's another to put it out there, and I wasn't getting as deep into like the character development at that time compared to what I'm doing right now for building this game for the Call of Cthulhu universe.
I'm really excited to see the game in the Call of Cthulhu universe when that comes out.
Well, I'll just say this about that one. It's still following this theme of playing more for POC characters, and I'm a supporter of Darker Hue Studios with the Harlem Unbound and the Haunted or Weird West, which are POC-centered games set in those environments for POC characters. So my characters in the Call of Cthulhu adventure are all POCs dealing with a Cthulhu mythos cult and event in 1921 on a train.
Oh, in the Lovecraft kind of era.
Exactly. So this is in some ways, I'm playing with some of the themes that are and tropes that are necessary there, but I'm switching them because it's like, here's what the story would happen at the other end of the train.
Right. Fascinating.
And so that's playing out also here in Chult, is like, here's all the things, like I had to create a bard school, I had to create a magic school. Because, I mean, let's be frank, wizards aren't that stupid. They know arcane magic is going to show up wherever possible. If you don't control where those sources are coming up, you've got your next despot or spirit that is taking control of people. So them putting a magic school, even though it's a limited magic school in Chult, is necessary. And that's some of the things that weren't in the development of the original book.
That's kind of outside of the story that I think Wizards of the Coast imagined people would be telling with Tomb of Annihilation. I guess, do you recommend a similar approach either for Tomb of Annihilation or for other modules like Strahd? Do you kind of recommend this sort of approach to other DMs? Like, hey, if you're these worlds that have these tropes and kind of this, especially modules where it's like you're going somewhere else, you're coming from outside to be the savior. Do you recommend this approach of saying, hey, the characters can just be from that place? Do you think that is portable?
I think it will depend on the setting, and if you want to play to the module, yes. And I think it's a very necessary thing. So let's take Curse of Strahd. How would this party have come together if they were all essentially the
Vistani?
The Vistani, who have decided, even though they've all got this arrangement with Strahd, what if they had a reason not to? What if these are Vistani who had been out in the rest of the world, lost their way, and hadn't known they could come back to to the Bovrovia, and now what does it mean for them knowing that there's other options?
Absolutely, yeah. I think, one question that Riley and I have talked about a little bit is why do people run modules, right? What is the appeal? What is the draw of these settings that often come with elements that don't feel like they tell an engaging and complete story? I guess.
Well, it's also.
I love your perspective. Yeah.
Well, it's on one hand, it's also the aspect of tropes.
Yes.
It's like Strahd definitely fits all of the whole creepy vampire tropes.
Absolutely.
If you listen to B.J. Did Walters and the Black Die Society, they hit a bunch of the other tropes of horror in their journeys through the myths.
Yes.
And that was one of the other things I was building too into the game was, and this would have come up more towards the end, is that essentially, again, the gods know what's going to happen if Dindar wakes up. So one of the things they're also, as a failsafe, is they're not going to let our maestro die. They've actually prepared a zone in the dread domains for him there, which would remove the energy and then all the energy he's absorbed from Dindar off away as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that also meant that at any point in time, if I ever played a game or ran a game in the dread domains, I had a domain of Chult as well.
Right. It would. Okay. So you're really thinking ahead on that front as well.
Yeah. So a bunch of this that transpired was, and if anything, Chult is my go-to setting if I'm going to play a Dungeons and Dragons game, just because I put so much work into the environment.
Absolutely.
To be setting adventures there. And this was something that a couple of my players would point out is like, you've created enough things with the environment and build that you could always put settings in this in place. You've created enough significant characters in this essentially new history that you can do playable. Because one of those things that if I ever ran another game is like, okay, so you're playing these 3 divinely born children of my previous characters.
Yes.
One of the other sub-adventures that happened there was also the birth. One of the NPCs that they became attached to got taken to limbo, ran into Shar, and now has become back as a wild magic sorcerer.
Very cool.
And so you could be playing their misadventures. You could be playing essentially the next generation of these characters in the things with going on with Chult, because one of the things I had set up, because I set up a couple other things with this campaign, in dealing with Dindar, they needed to siphon off that necromantic energy. So they needed black diamonds to do so, because I was setting that up as something that's in the material in the environment that they could use. And they ended up, I said you needed 3, they ended up having 5. So what happened to these 5 black diamonds that have got so much necromantic energy just imbued into them?
So you have a whole sequel campaign set up, and
I have the threads for it. And with that, too, comes the standpoint of, okay, one of the items that I created, and I think I set it up on the D&D Beyond, was, we know one of the classic D&D items is the Deck of Many Things.
Absolutely.
So I created the Bone Oracles.
Okay.
And these they're my version of it, which had various magical properties depending on which bone was pulled forth and what spell was rolled for it.
Very cool. Okay.
And these are all high-level spells done at like 9th level. So this item is not only used for divination, it can be used for spell casting, which came up several times during the game where they needed that item to like summon a temple of the gods, which is where the pregnancy delivery happened, as a god from the Calabash, I think it was, decided they wanted to take out that character to get back at that particular character's god.
Oh wow! Okay, so you've built some very cool, both kind of the fantasy aspect as well as kind of the material world aspect of this setting.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other questions that came up too at one point, because I know this was stuff I had also said to my group, they asked, so where's the elves? And I said, I've got that plan. You just haven't got there yet. And so at that point, as they were advancing, I pulled the Dalama Mauve elves from the Chronicles of Waganda, or Wagandu Chronicles, and put them in this environment, and also created my own Underdark.
So but did the players in this campaign go to the Underdark?
Yep, so I gave Chult an Underdark. And that the Black Elves were living there, because they'd also had an arrangement with Uptau, their job was to hold his shadow.
Interesting. Okay.
And so that's one of those other things that, when going through the history that has been written, unlike all the other gods, Uptau has a shadow character, a shadow version of himself. Then I basically said, in explaining that it was formed after the battle with Dindar as part of Dindar's poison against him.
Yes.
And that it's because of the shadow character that they have so much undead there. That it was him, essentially, whenever somebody died and was put back to the world, that shadow character ripped a portion of those people off.
Got it. Oh, this is so cool.
So what always came was what came back, even though their soul would come back and be reborn, their body came back in the zombie form.
Got it. It sounds like, okay, it sounds like you mentioned a few inspirations, I guess, and some media that you've drawn from. Mm-hmm. Would you mind, I guess, telling the audience what your biggest sources of inspiration and where you drew material from for this world building and for this campaign?
Actually, a bunch of it comes from studying history. Long-time geek, so I've sort of collected a lot of material over the hand, but there were points like I said, the Chronicles of Wagandu, which I know is coming out with their world book, which I'm so waiting for. But their initial material came out, and that's where I took the Moth Elves from to put into this aspect, because I like the Moth Elves.
Yes.
Looking at, again, the sort of stuff that's going in Call of Cthulhu with Darker Hue Studios was another place, because I did play out a number of horror tropes, such as like a murder hotel, The Forgotten Rest.
Oh my.
I'm not going to give too much of that one away, but that one was one that, my characters by that point was like, you could see the fatigue on their faces with the challenges that I had put in there. Looking at history, I mean, I had a book of African baby names, which I was constantly referring to for characters.
Oh, fascinating.
But then again, history.
Yeah.
What is the history I've watched? What is the history I've lived? And what's the history I've read? In the aspect of what was going on for our albino barbarian was about returning to his home and bring his people back. And that is the... I usually mispronounce it, but it's Hakamar, which is the albino dwarf's stronghold, and actually the doorway to where Dindar is contained. And so that's one of those where it's like, you could say I pulled stuff from Roots, the movie, to put into this as well, and that aspect of coming home and regaining your home, but also regaining your identity.
Right. Is there any history that you've read that you'd recommend that people read if they want to run a similar campaign?
Not specific history, because again, this is bits and pieces I've collected over the years.
Right.
And what suddenly either overtly sparked in my memory or what was covertly sparking in my memory with the intention of setting up this storyline.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess finally, is there anything you'd like to plug? Anything that you'd like the audience to check out unrelated to the campaign?
Well, I would definitely say check out Symphony Entertainment. That's one. Check out Darker Hue Studios is another one. Check out the Waganda Chronicles. I may be mispronouncing their name. I would also make sure you're looking at things like As Nancy, which is done by Eric Ellis. Check out Harriet Tubman, the kind of almost like a Buffy-esque character in this case. Harriet Tubman, the demon huntress.
From Harriet Tubman, the Demon Hunter is from what? From what property?
So as Nancy and Harriet Tubman are some indie comics that I would recommend checking out.
Excellent.
I know they've come out in graphic novel form. I know it's also supported them in Kickstarter. Look up from David Jennings, Megascope Records, the I think it's called Mojo Bag. I think it's, if I remember what it's called. So I look at any work by Tanana Reeve Do as stuff. So looking at black horror, because one of those other things is trying to not to make this trauma porn, but also stories that these are people's lives. These are histories. And as someone has said, something else I was listening to is like, what happens in your world when it's not in crisis? And that's part of what you're going to be building to build to these environments, is because it's not always crisis.
And ideally, you're working towards a state of non-crisis in the game.
Exactly. So what is the lives that everyone's going to be eventually going through? I mean, at one point, one of the things that happened because of our Joaquin connection is that Joaquin decides to syncretize herself to Chult. So therefore, she creates another of her own identities that is now fully Chultan and operates under a different name, which is an example of what happened with Afro-Caribbean religion, with what you have with voodoo, leukemia, Paulo, and so forth, and the necessity to syncretize it to the Catholic saints for it to survive.
Right. Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. Yeah. I have a soft spot for Joaquin-based stories. In general, I think that having kind of a global god of capitalism is an interesting concept that Wizards has given us.
Right, and so that aspect of she's been operating so much when the Port Nines are with the foreign market, but now that these kingdoms are coming back, how does she have influence with them? And they're not going to be as quick to come to Joaquin, the white goddess, as they will come to Jamala, the Chultan goddess of commerce.
Right, even though this is still engaging in the same trade and everything.
And that was one of the developments that came up with our goblin cleric character of Joaquin.
Right, I guess this is like an embodiment of that syncretization.
And again, one of the things I was playing with, because we even make an adventure, we also have an adventure where we go off to the Beastlands and the higher planes to get stuff, and we have a bunch of adventures, even one that turned into a Looney Tunes episode there. But one of this aspect of the material plane and the threat of the death curse is something that's having its effect all over the place. So one of the other things I brought up is that an agreement, and the characters even have an agreement with Asmodeus, that the Lord of the Nine Hells decides to suspend a contract or pretend certain rules because it does not want the material plane falling prey to the death curse, because it loses its supplies of devils against the abyss.
Absolutely, right.
And eventually, as it comes up, and this is when we have the Kitsune character who's connected to the Fae. The Fae don't want to lose the material plane because now their new neighbor is going to be the devil plane.
Right, if the material plane collapses, wow.
So they've got a vested interest in not having any of these things happen, and Dindar upping the death count is not a good thing.
For anyone. Do you have any, I guess, closing thoughts or any messages you want to send to people about running their campaigns that kind of take from what you've told them about here?
Don't be limited just because of what they did provide you as the base model. It's a starting place. It's not the finishing place. And do not be afraid to start making these adventures about the people who actually live in these places, as opposed to somebody who's coming in from outside. We have too much a history of that, and we have too much of that being normalized.
I think that's incredible advice, and I think that's a great note to end on. Perry, thank you so much for coming on Campaign Spotlight and sharing your absolutely fascinating world with us.
No problem. I hope it's useful, and I'm happy to try and help. You will find, if you go on D&D Beyond, I did create some of the monsters and characters, so they are there up on there. If you, depending on where you're looking for stuff around Chult, like my etheric troll. So It's not just a normal troll, it's also got confusion. That it
Very
gets
cool.
passed as well.
Let's talk afterwards.
Yeah.
I'll make sure that we link to those in the show notes so that people can enjoy them.
Exactly. So they're there. And read many more authors, especially of color.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thank you for having me.
Okay, this campaign actually sounds so cool.
Well, I guess the question is, before you do you want to know how the story was supposed to end?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right, so, and this will be if you want to do it as an outtake. So what had been happening was, because the bard had been infused with the magic of Dindar, he couldn't leave the same zone where Dindar was. So what he was doing was using that magic to create simulacrums and sending them out in the world over the course of history to affect the continent.
And they can do all the magic that he can, because this is a simulacrum. Okay.
And they've got the power of Dindar beyond. But of course, the problem is that the more powerful he gets, the more the madness of Dindar increases as well. So there comes a point where he can't keep sending out simulacrums.
Right.
And so my characters had gotten to Rakamar, which is about and dealing with the situation there with the fire newts, and had descended into the multi-dimensional place under Chult, where Dindar was.
Yes.
And so due to certain other circumstances, they were going to have a showdown with the Necromite Queen, because someone had managed to banish the Queen from the material plane back there, so they were still going to have to deal with it. And so then they were going to eventually make it into the chamber with Dindar and the Maestro, and they were going to have this is where we have the big battle. We have the reveal of the Coatl form, and they're fighting various versions of him that have been so maddened and powered with all the various heroes' weaponry they had collected over the years. They get to the point where they've almost gotten defeated, which is when the Raven Queen steps in and says, "No, you can't finish defeating them, but we've prepared a place to keep things safe," and takes him off to the direct domains and creates the Chult analog there.
Right.
They perform the ritual to put Dindar back to sleep again and rechain him.
And the players perform that ritual.
We were going to perform the ritual for that, to do so. And so then what we do is we fast forward a number of years where we have our bard character, our griot character, retelling the story in Mesro to this crowd, with his wife, the Kitsune character, by his side, and at which point one of his grandchildren comes up and asks the question, "What happened to the black diamonds?" And it's like, "Oh, your parents didn't tell you that." Well, now we start your griot training, as well as they pick up, as the next generation, as the next griot is being told the stories that they will eventually be embodying for the future.
Right. Oh, that's such a fun ending. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It's just sad we never got to that ending. So, but that was the ending, and that, because so that was the big denouement. Our goblin character, because of what had to happen, there was arrangements made with the devils that he was going to have to go spend several years working for them, confirming contracts, basically being a notary. And so that was his adventure, and one becomes the Queen of Mimbala, another becomes her new champion, protector of the city. So,
I mean, I never really thought of how much demand devils would have for notaries.
Yep.
But like, of course, there'd be a whole like paralegal. Okay, this. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, that was the intended ending. And that would have unlocked for other stories if we ever wanted to play more in Chult.
The sequels, right? No, I hope you get to come back to the setting. It really does sound so fun.
Oh yeah, well, just put it this way: this was the player binder.
Okay.
This is the monster binder. Yes, it just kept growing throughout the game. It's like
yeah. You did so much world building for this. It sounds incredible. That's all for this week.
Thanks so much to Perry for coming on Campaign Spotlight.
I'm Dungeon Inspector Jake.
And I'm Production Master Riley.
If you're enjoying the show, subscribe and leave a review.
It helps other people find the show, and it keeps the many-toothed creature that chases us in our nightmares at bay.
For more on the show, including links to all our social media, visit foldedfrequencies.com/campaignspotlight.